Hi everyone, we're going to be talking today about reasons for exploration. We need to know why the Spanish were moving around the world in order to understand what actually happened when they got to the Americas. Hopefully you've already watched the videos on the Aztecs from last week. If you haven't, then you might want to go back and watch those. But without further ado, we'll get started with reasons for exploration. So we are looking at Europe here. We've got a whole bunch of Europeans, and for about 1,000 years, Europe had kind of been in a little bit of a rut. Like, since the fall of the Roman Empire, people were very, very static. There wasn't a lot of movement, and people tended to live in very rural communities. This meant that international trade generally wasn't a big thing. The kings and queens at the time kind of discouraged it. Like, there wasn't a lot of international trade being encouraged at this time period. People were living in their own environments. There were, of course, obviously people who made money buying and selling, but there was no incentive for anyone to trade outside your local area. It's not like people were going across multiple different countries to do it, and they would just do it in their own local area. But in the Middle Ages, after the Crusades, there were a whole bunch of soldiers that went off to Jerusalem, and they decided to bring back a whole bunch of stuff from the Middle East. And this kind of opened people's eyes to the possibilities of international trade. All the cool stuff that you could get out of the Middle East and beyond. People in Europe started to realize that there was a little bit more to it. So they started bringing in things like silk on the left here. We've got some knowledge in the middle on those scrolls and some gold that they brought from the Middle East back to Europe. And so people started to explore the idea that maybe there was more to the world than just what they had in their local area. People like Marco Polo, who we can see here, were very, very excited about the prospect of going eastwards and finding the treasures that lay beyond the Middle East. They wanted to figure out exactly where those silks were coming from, and so more people, including Marco Polo, went eastwards looking for those new treasures and knowledge. By the end of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire, which had owned a lot of the area where the Silk Road was, they started to crumble a little bit. Their entire empire started to fall apart, which led to the Silk Road being unstable and unprotected. And with the fall of Constantinople, which was caused by these big cannons that the Ottomans used, the rise of the Ottoman Empire, suddenly European nations couldn't trade through the Silk Road anymore. They needed to look elsewhere for their opportunities for trade. So they looked to the sea, and the number one place that people were looking to get to was called the Indies, which we can see here. It's places like India, China, Japan, and the Indonesian islands, things like the Philippines and that today, places like Vietnam. Those kind of countries were really, really exotic for Europeans. And so they were very, very excited to see what resources, specifically spices, they knew about spices that the Europeans could get from this area. Now, spices and silks and knowledge and all that kind of stuff are really, really important because they need those things to trade, right? And spices are really good for keeping your food safe to eat, right? It will preserve the food that you'd eat, so you wouldn't need to worry so much about things going off, because that would be the most frustrating thing in the world. If you ate an entire meal and all of the food was rotten, that wouldn't be a particularly good thing. So we want to make sure that it's nice and safe to eat. You can preserve it with some spices, that would be great, but there's also all those other things as well. If the Silk Road was closed, though, they wouldn't be able to get those via the land route anymore. They would need to find a different way to get it. And when the feudal system started collapsing a little bit, the kings and queens in Europe started to lose a little bit of power in some of those places. The people at the bottom of the feudal system started to get a little bit more power. People were moving into cities. More and more people wanted these luxury items. Suddenly a sea route to the Indies is sounding like a pretty good idea. If we can find a ship that can sail to the Indies, then we'll be able to get those resources and we won't need to worry about dealing with the Ottomans in the middle. Now, money for merchants and explorers wasn't the only reason that people wanted to explore around the world. Obviously, European rulers, like the one you can see here, want precious metals like gold and silver in order to maintain their wealth. And more importantly, to maintain their very expensive wars. There's a lot of conflict in Europe, and it's very expensive to maintain soldiers. So if you were able to exploit the riches that were in Asia, find all of those resources, then not only would you be able to win those wars, but you'd be able to exert your influence elsewhere, which would be really, really good. You could get the upper hand in those conflicts. Now, the rulers of those countries were also desperate for other resources, things like food, building materials, that would help them build up their empires, and they were also looking for people to do that work. So people started to think about slavery as a potential option as well. It's obviously not something that we'll talk too much about this year, but in your Year 9 work, you'll probably look into this a little bit more. Slavery was also a thing that people were very interested in exploiting and considered slaves a resource, not people. Finally, religion was also a really strong contributing factor to Europeans wanting to explore new lands. We've obviously talked a little bit about the Crusades here. We've got a crusader on the left fighting against someone who is Muslim on the right. That was a big conflict for a lot of European history. They've been at odds for about 1,000 years, Islamic people and Christians. So the Catholic rulers in Europe, particularly the Spanish ones, we've got Isabella I and her husband Ferdinand II here, both from Spain. They saw the riches in Asia as under threat from Islam. Obviously, people in the Middle East are closer to Asia, and if they can't get access to those goods themselves, then they're going to need to find a way to stop the Muslims in the middle from getting them first. So, if only they could find a way around the Horn of Africa, around Africa, to find a route to get those goods where they don't need to go through the Middle East. That would be particularly good. Now, many European nations were really struggling with this problem. It's like, I don't know how we're actually going to get into this period. Like some people, like the English and the Dutch, we've got the English flag at the top there, the Dutch flag down the bottom. Both of those flags obviously change into the future, but that's what they looked like at the time. The English and the Dutch both had the idea that what they would do is they would sail around Africa, around a place called the Horn of Africa, which is highlighted here, in order to get themselves a route from Europe to Asia. They'd either go around the outside of Africa all the way around South Africa and past the Horn of Africa, or eventually, a few hundred years later, they'd invent a canal called the Suez Canal, which went through Egypt and connected the Mediterranean into that kind of inland sea area there. But for the most part, they had to go around the outside and get past the Horn of Africa, which is a very difficult and treacherous journey. It's really, really tough to get around there. It doesn't look like it on this map of the world, but it is. And so they decided to go around the Horn of Africa looking for a sea route. However, there was this very enticing idea floating around the courts of Europe. What if they went west and met up with the Indies on the other side? We have to think that maybe that's a potential option. Now, people knew that the Earth was round, but they weren't sure that it was actually possible to travel to the Indies from there. Some people theorized that there had to be another landmass there, but we were looking for just one guy, one man, who would potentially be crazy enough to search for that particular route to the Indies, and that man ended up being Christopher Columbus. So we'll have a talk about him a little bit more next time. Thanks everyone for watching this one. I appreciate you coming by. Yeah, we'll talk about Christopher Columbus next time and figure out what he got up to on his journeys. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye.